Perched up high on an artillery-battered hilltop in the Korean Peninsula's Iron Triangle. The Battle of Outpost Harry unfolded in June of 1953 as one of the final and yet most brutal struggles of the Korean War. The outpost itself was small, just 1,280 foot rise of earth and trenches, but its importance to both the UN and Chinese forces far exceeded its size. From its crest, defenders could deny enemy observation into the Kumwa Valley and shield a vulnerable stretch of the United Nations main line of resistance. If it fell, however, commanders feared a withdrawal of 6 miles to a less favorable defensive line. But soldiers ordered to hold it, however, the strategic stakes were less abstract. They knew the hill simply as a place where survival was uncertain, where each night might be their last. Outpost Harriet stood apart from neighboring positions, unlike nearby outposts like Tom and Dick, which lay closer to the MLR and draw direct support from machine guns and light mortars. Harry, on the other hand, was isolated, over 400 yards forward and higher than the friendly line. You see, supplies had been carried up a winding, exposed route under constant observation and fire. The trench system at the top formed a rough circle with deep communication trenches connecting bunkers, firing positions, and a forward observation post. It could only hold about 150 men or entire company. Those men depended less on nearby support and more on distant artillery and heavy mortars, which would prove decisive in the days ahead. In the first week of June 1953, the hill trembled under growing pressure. Enemy artillery and mortar fire steadily increased, rising from a steady harassment to a clear prelude to attack. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed what the defenders already suspected, that elements of the Chinese 74th Division were massing for an assault. The men rotating onto the post, companies from the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division and the attached Greek Expeditionary Force, prepared as best as they could. Ammunition was stacked, communications checked, and final protective fire plans plotted. They knew the attack would come at night. It began on June 10th. As darkness settled, a massive artillery and mortar barrage slammed into the hill, churning trenches into dust and splintering bunkers. Under that cover, waves of Chinese infantry advanced up the slopes. D Company of the 15th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of the first assault. The attackers surged forward in overwhelming numbers, at times outnumbering the defenders by staggering margins. Despite intense defensive fire, however, including artillery fire that burst above the ground with deadly airbursts, the enemy breached the trenches. What followed was close, chaotic, and brutal. In the narrow, twisting trenches, rifles gave way to grenades, bayonets, and even bare hands. Amid the chaos, acts of leadership held the line together. Sergeant Ola Mize, then a sergeant, moved through the shattered defenses, reorganizing positions and rallying his men under relentless fire. As casualties mounted and positions were overrun and retaken, artillery fire was called dangerously close, so close that it exploded above both friend and foe, breaking up assaults at the last possible moment. The cloudless night of June 10th pressed down upon Outpost Harry like a heavy canvas that evening in 1953. High on the battled hilltop the Iron Triangle of the North Korean Peninsula, the Medic Company K of the U.S. Army's 15th Infantry Regiment clung to trenches that had been torn apart and rebuilt so many times that they barely resembled earthworks anymore. The ground was churned into mud and craters, the air thick with smoke and dust. Even few seconds, the sky split open with artillery fire, most of it from the Chinese regiments attacking their position. Master Sergeant Ola Mize moved through it like a man who had already been decided fear would not get a seat at the men's table that night. Another barrage crashed into the hill, shaking the ground so violently that it knocked the men off their feet. Dirt and shrapnel rained down. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted for a medic. The enemy was coming again. Everyone knew it. They always came after the bombardment. Then word reached them. A man was down on a listening post forward of his position. Mize didn't hesitate. "Get a medic," he snapped, already moving. The path forward was nothing but open ground under direct observation. Artillery shells whistled overhead, slamming into the slope with bone-shaking force. Machine gun fire stitched the darkness. It was the kind of ground soldiers crossed only when they had no choice. Mize chose it anyway. He and the corpsmen pushed forward, hunched low, stumbling through craters and debris. An explosion threw both men onto the ground, the shockwave slamming into their chests. For a moment, the world rang silent. Then the noise came roaring back. They found the wounded soldier where he had fallen, barely conscious. Mize grabbed him without ceremonial pompous. "Stay with me," he shouted in his thick Alabama accent, hauling the man up. The return was worse. The enemy had the range now. Shells landed closer. Closer. Too close. Dirt blasted into Mize's face, nearly blinding him. The wounded man sagged heavily, dead weight. The corpsman struggled beside him. Still, they made it back. No sooner had they crossed into the main position from the next wave hit. Chinese troops poured into the outpost, slipping through shattered wire and broken trenches. The fight wasn't at a distance anymore. It was inside the perimeter. Shadows moved in the smoke. Grenades exploded in tight space. Rifles cracked at point-blank range. Mize took charge of a section of the line that was already beginning to buckle. "Look here," he shouted, forcing the men into position while directing their fire. An explosion ripped through the trench, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the dirt. For a moment, everything went black. Then he was able to get up again. Another blast followed, closer this time. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, body screaming in protest, but he got up again. A third explosion threw him sideways, shrapnel whining past him. Somewhere behind him, a man cried out. Mize staggered, shook his head, and went right back to firing. The enemy had made it into the trench line. There was no clean front anymore, just pockets of desperate fighting. Mize gathered a handful of men and pushed forward, moving from bunker to bunker. He fired through firing ports, then shifted positions, lobbing grenades into enemy-held sections. Each explosion brought a few more seconds. Each movement pushed the enemy back a few more feet. At one point, he saw it happen. A Chinese soldier stepped out behind one of his men, rifle already coming up. Mize, though, fired first. The enemy soldier dropped before he could pull the trigger. The American had been aiming at turn, stunned, realizing how close he'd come to dying. No time for words. The fight rolled on. Mize kept moving, checking positions, handing out ammunition, gripping shoulders, shouting over the chaos. You're good! Stay in it! Keep firing! Then came the shout that cut through everything. The machine gun's down! The position was critical. Without it, the enemy could bore straight through the line. Mize didn't wait for orders. He moved towards the position at a run, bullets snapping past him. As he reached the emplacement, he saw why it had gone silent. Enemy soldiers had overrun it. He charged anyway. What followed was fast and violent of action. Rifle fire at close range. Grenades thrown in tight arcs. Shouts. Flashes. Bodies dropping in the confined space. Mize fought through them, driving the enemy out with sheer aggression. When it was over, the position was his again. He didn't stop. Fighting his way back toward the command post, he found several wounded men lying exposed. He took up a position to cover them, firing steadily, keeping the enemy at bay. Then, he got hold of a radio. Even as the battle raged around him, he began directing artillery fire, calm, precise, calling in rounds along the enemy's avenues of approach. Seconds later, the night lit up with friendly artillery fire, slamming into advancing formations, breaking them apart before they could reach the line. Hours blurred together. The attacks came in waves, probing, retreating, surging again. Each time, Mize was there, moving, fighting, organizing, refusing to let the line collapse. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon, the hill was a wreck of smoke and silence, punctuated by scattered gunfire. Mize gathered what man he could. We're taking it back, he said. They moved forward together in a final counterattack, tired, battered, but yet unbroken. The enemy, having spent itself against the defense, began to fall back. By sunrise, Outpost Harry was still in friendly hands. The cost, though, had been high. The ground told the story in dark and bloody detail, but the line had held. And through the longest night, and the worst of it, one constant had been the Master Sergeant, Mize, moving through fire and darkness, holding the defense together when it could have become apart. Not because he had to, but because he refused to do anything else. By dawn, the attackers withdrew, leaving the hill in American hands. But the cost was devastating. K Company was nearly destroyed. Its survivors immediately replaced by fresh troops, climbing the semi-exposed path under fire. The following nights brought no relief. On June 11 through 12, new companies took up the defense, only to face another barrage and renewed assault. Again, the attackers pushed into trenches, and again the fighting devolved into desperate, close-quarters combat. Reinforcements were rushed forward, sometimes arriving directly into the midst of battle. Tank and infantry elements operated in the valley below, firing into assembly areas and disrupting enemy movements, acting as a crucial diversion. By morning, the hill remained in UN hands, but only barely. As the battle stretched into June 12 through 16, a pattern emerged, a grim rhythm of war. Each night, artillery would announce the next attack. Infantry would follow, probing, assaulting, sometimes briefly seizing parts of the exposed trench line. The defenders would counterattack, often supported by precisely timed artillery barrages that created a protective ring of explosions around the outpost. By dawn, the attackers would withdraw, and the survivors would begin the work of recovery and repair. Daylight brought its own dangers: snipers, sporadic shelling, and the grim task of evacuating the wounded and dead. Fresh companies rotated in, knowing they were stepping into a position where the previous defenders had often been decimated. Not every night saw a full-scale assault. On June 13th through 14th, enemy forces conducted smaller actions, including attempts to recover their dead under covering fire. These moments revealed a shift in tactics: less emphasis on overwhelming assaults, more on probing and attrition. Yet, even these quiet periods were tense, filled with sporadic shelling and the constant threat of sudden attack. By mid-June, the burden of defense shifted increasingly to the Greek contingent. The soldiers of the Greek Expeditionary Force had already been earned a reputation for resilience. They gave the outpost a name of their own: Heros, after the ferryman of the underworld in Greek mythology. It was a fitting title. For those who fought there, the hills seemed to exist somewhere between time and death. After a brief lull on June 16th through 17th, during which engineers worked to repair and strengthen the battered defenses, the final major assault came in the early hours of June 18th. Once again, artillery fire blanketed the hill. Chinese forces attacked from multiple directions: north, northeast, and even the east, and even the northwest. Moving through their own bombardment to close with the defenders, they reached the trenches, and once more the battle descended into savage hand-to-hand fighting. This time, however, the defenders were ready. Artillery was brought down in a coordinated protective ring, isolating the battlefield and preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the fight. Greek troops reinforced the line, while tank infantry teams in the valley disrupted enemy movements below. Within the trenches, the fighting was fierce as many before, but gradually the attackers were pushed back. By dawn, the final assault had failed. The hill remained in UN hands. When the battle ended, the cost was clear. The defenders had suffered heavy casualties: dozens killed, hundreds wounded, and missing across multiple units. The attacking Chinese forces had committed repeated regimental-scale assaults, supported by tens of thousands of artillery rounds. By some estimates, the 74th Division had been rendered combat ineffective, its ability to continue offensive operations severely degraded. Yet, the ground itself had not changed. Outpost Harry remained what it had always been: a small scarred hilltop, its trenches shattered and rebuilt time and again. What had changed, though, was its meaning. In the final weeks before the Korean War armistice, battles like this were not fought for meaning, sweeping advances, but for position, leverage, and resolve. Outpost Harry became a symbol of that reality, a place where a few hundred men, rotating in and out, held against repeated assaults their firepower, endurance, and sheer determination.